The most dangerous moment is not always when an empath cries. Sometimes it is the moment they stop crying. At first, repeated hurt feels impossible to ignore. Every betrayal feels heavy. Every broken promise creates another question. Every moment of rejection creates a need to understand what went wrong. A deeply sensitive person may respond by explaining their feelings, forgiving the person, searching for reasons, and giving another opportunity. They may tell themselves that people make mistakes, that everyone deserves understanding, and that one painful experience should not define an entire relationship. But when the same kind of pain keeps returning, the mind begins to process it differently. The emotional reaction that once appeared instantly can slowly become quieter. The person may still care deeply, but they may no longer respond in the same way. Their silence can become longer. Their explanations can become shorter. Their expectations can become smaller. And from the outside, this transformation can look like coldness. It can look like they suddenly stopped caring. But internally, a much more complicated process may be taking place. Repeated emotional stress can affect the way a person responds to future emotional situations. When the brain repeatedly connects closeness with disappointment, it can begin becoming more cautious. Instead of immediately opening the door, the person may start watching, evaluating, and protecting themselves. This is one of the lesser-known parts of emotional exhaustion. A person does not always stop feeling because they no longer have feelings. Sometimes they stop showing those feelings because constantly processing the same pain has become exhausting. That is where this story becomes much deeper than simply saying, "An empath finally walked away." In this video, we are going inside that psychological transformation and examining what can happen internally when a highly emotionally sensitive person is hurt again and again. You will learn why the first response is often understanding instead of anger, why repeated disappointment can change the way trust is experienced, and why emotional exhaustion can eventually replace emotional reactions. We will also uncover why a person may stop explaining themselves after years of trying to be understood, and why that silence does not automatically mean they have stopped loving or caring. You will discover the difference between empathy and self-abandonment, and why one of the most important transformations happens when compassion begins to develop alongside stronger boundaries. We will also explore why they may start paying more attention to patterns than promises, consistency than potential, and behavior than words. And perhaps most importantly, you will understand why the final stage is not necessarily becoming cold, ruthless, or emotionally unavailable. It can be something far more powerful. It can be learning how to remain compassionate without giving unlimited access to the people who repeatedly cause pain. There is a point where a person stops asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and begins asking a very different question. "What is this pattern teaching me?" That shift can change everything. So stay with this video until the end, because the final revelation may completely change the way you understand an empath who suddenly becomes quiet after being hurt too many times. Their silence may not be the absence of emotion. It may be the result of finally understanding what their emotions have been trying to tell them. Welcome to our channel. If you enjoy deep psychological insights into human behavior, emotional patterns, empathy, relationships, and the hidden forces that shape the way people respond to pain, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for more. The first response to repeated emotional hurt is often not anger, it is understanding. A highly sensitive person may experience pain and still immediately search for a reason behind the behavior that caused it. Instead of thinking, "This person treated me badly," their mind may first ask, "Why would they do this?" That question can become the beginning of a long emotional process. They may wonder whether the situation was misunderstood, whether the other person was under pressure, whether they were dealing with personal problems, or whether they themselves reacted too strongly. They may remember the good moments and use them to explain away the painful ones. This is where empathy can become both a strength and a burden. Empathy allows a person to understand that another human being may have fears, insecurities, wounds, or difficult experiences influencing their behavior. But understanding the reason behind someone's behavior does not automatically make that behavior healthy. A person can understand why someone is angry and still recognize that being repeatedly disrespected is not acceptable. A person can understand someone's childhood wounds without allowing those wounds to become an excuse for repeated harm. This distinction is important because empathy is not one single psychological process. Cognitive empathy involves understanding another person's perspective or emotional state, while affective empathy involves sharing or emotionally responding to another person's feelings. These processes can overlap, but they are not identical. A person may be extremely good at understanding what another person feels while still struggling to decide what they should personally tolerate. That is why someone can recognize another person's pain and still remain trapped in a painful relationship. They are not necessarily weak. They may simply be trying to make sense of behavior that keeps violating their emotional expectations. In the beginning, giving another chance can feel reasonable. After all, one mistake does not define a person. One argument does not automatically mean a relationship is unhealthy. One disappointing moment may deserve a conversation rather than an immediate ending. The problem begins when isolated incidents stop being isolated. The same wound appears in different forms. The same promise gets broken again. The same apology is followed by the same behavior. The same explanation is needed again and again. Slowly, the mind begins collecting evidence. One painful event becomes connected to another. A broken promise is no longer just a broken promise. It reminds the person of every previous promise that was broken. A sudden change in someone's tone may remind them of the last argument. A period of silence may bring back every previous experience of being ignored. This is where emotional pain begins changing from an event into an expectation. The person may start asking themselves, is this going to happen again? That question can appear even during moments when nothing is currently wrong. The relationship may look peaceful on the outside, but internally, trust has changed. The person may still love. They may still care. They may still hope. Yet some part of their mind has learned that closeness can also lead to pain. This does not mean the brain has permanently decided that every relationship is dangerous. It means repeated experiences can influence how future situations are interpreted. When stress continues for a long period, emotional regulation can become more difficult. The person may become more alert to changes in behavior, more sensitive to signs of rejection, or more cautious about emotional vulnerability. Their mind is no longer dealing with each event as if it exists alone. It is comparing the present with the past. That comparison can be protective because it helps a person recognize patterns. But it can also become exhausting when the person remains emotionally prepared for the next disappointment. Then another stage begins. The emotional reaction starts becoming quieter, not necessarily because the person feels less, but because they are tired of processing the same emotional cycle. At first they cry, then they explain, then they ask questions, then they argue, then they forgive, then they try again. After enough repetitions, something begins to change. The emotional system may become exhausted by the constant demand to recover from the same kind of pain. This is where the difference between emotional numbness and emotional exhaustion becomes important. Numbness can look like a lack of feeling, but emotional exhaustion can exist underneath a person who still feels deeply. They may still be hurt, but they no longer have the energy to turn every feeling into a conversation. They may still be disappointed, but they no longer want to spend hours proving why the disappointment matters. They may still care, but caring no longer automatically means responding. Research on empathy and compassion fatigue has found that strong affective empathy can, in some circumstances, be associated with greater emotional burden, particularly when someone is repeatedly exposed to emotional distress without enough recovery or effective regulation. This helps explain why someone who appears incredibly compassionate can eventually reach a point where they simply cannot keep absorbing everyone else's emotional weight. Their silence may come before true detachment. It may be exhaustion before it is indifference. And that silence creates another major psychological shift. They begin explaining themselves less. In the early stages, they may believe that if they can just communicate clearly enough, the other person will finally understand. So they explain why the comment hurt. They explain what they needed. They explain what they meant. They explain why they reacted. They explain the boundary. Then they explain the boundary again. But repeated explanations can teach a painful lesson. Understanding does not always create change. Someone can understand exactly why their behavior hurts you, and still continue doing it. At that point, the purpose of communication begins to change. The person is no longer trying to convince someone to understand their pain. They begin watching what the other person actually does with the information they have been given. This is a major turning point because attention moves away from words and toward patterns. The question becomes less about intention and more about behavior. Did they mean to hurt me? Becomes less important than what keeps happening after we have discussed this. That shift can look cold to someone who benefited from the person's endless explanations, but internally it may represent growing clarity. The person is learning that compassion does not require endless negotiation. They can understand another person's reasons without allowing those reasons to erase the consequences of their behavior. This is where empathy slowly begins turning into discernment. Discernment means noticing the difference between someone who made a mistake and someone who repeatedly creates the same situation. It means recognizing that an apology and changed behavior are not the same thing. It means understanding that someone's difficult past may explain their reactions without making you responsible for absorbing the damage. The mature form of empathy does not say, "I understand your pain, therefore I must tolerate whatever you do." It says, "I understand that you have pain, and I can still decide what is healthy for me." That distinction can completely change the way a sensitive person approaches relationships. They may stop measuring people only by how much they need help and start measuring them by how consistently they respect boundaries. They may stop asking who deserves endless chances and start asking who actually uses those chances to grow. They may remain compassionate while becoming much more selective about access to their emotional world, and this is where repeated hurt begins producing a transformation that many people misunderstand. The person does not necessarily lose empathy. They begin separating empathy from self-abandonment. They realize that understanding someone does not mean carrying their problems. Forgiving someone does not mean restoring the same level of access. Loving someone does not mean accepting repeated emotional injury. And caring about another person's struggles does not require ignoring what those struggles are doing to you. The emotional person who once reacted immediately may now pause. They may observe. They may take time before responding. They may ask whether the situation deserves another explanation, or whether the pattern has already explained itself. That pause is important because it creates space between feeling and action, and within that space, discernment begins to grow. The person starts recognizing that their heart can remain open without leaving the door unlocked for everyone. Their empathy can remain intact while their boundaries become stronger. Their compassion can survive without requiring constant sacrifice. And once that realization begins, the entire meaning of their silence starts to change. There comes a point when emotional openness stops being automatic. A person who once shared everything may begin choosing carefully what they reveal, who they trust, and how quickly they allow someone into their inner world. From the outside, this change can look like distance. They may become quieter, more private, less eager to explain what they are feeling. They may listen more than they speak, observe more than they react, and take much longer to decide whether someone deserves their trust. But this does not necessarily mean they have lost their ability to love. In many cases, it means they have learned that emotional access has value. Earlier, they may have given people the benefit of the doubt almost immediately. They may have believed that if they showed enough kindness, patience, and understanding, the other person would eventually treat that trust with the same care. Repeated disappointment can challenge that belief. The person begins to understand that not everyone who receives emotional access knows how to respect it. Not everyone who hears their vulnerabilities will protect them. Not everyone who receives their kindness will return it. So the door does not necessarily close completely. The person simply stops leaving it wide open. Trust becomes something that develops through consistency. Vulnerability becomes something that follows evidence. They may watch how someone behaves when they are frustrated. They may notice whether that person respects small boundaries. They may pay attention to whether promises are followed by action. They may observe how the person treats others when there is nothing to gain. These details become more important than charming words or intense emotional moments. This is a subtle psychological shift because the person is no longer deciding whether someone is good based only on how strongly they feel about them. They are beginning to evaluate whether the relationship is actually safe and stable enough for deeper emotional investment. And that is where compassion begins separating itself from self-abandonment. For a long time, a highly compassionate person may confuse caring with responsibility. If someone is struggling, they feel responsible for helping. If someone is hurting, they feel responsible for understanding. If someone is angry, they may immediately wonder what they did wrong. If someone withdraws, they may try to repair the situation even when they were not the cause of the problem. Repeated hurt eventually forces a difficult question. Where does compassion end and self-neglect begin? There is a profound difference between saying "I care about you" and saying "I will destroy my peace to keep you comfortable." The first is compassion. The second can become self-abandonment. Learning this difference can be one of the most important stages of emotional maturity. The person begins realizing that forgiveness does not require returning to the same dynamic. They can forgive someone and still keep their distance. They can understand someone's trauma without becoming responsible for healing it. They can recognize why someone behaves a certain way without accepting that behavior as healthy. They can love someone while deciding that continued closeness is damaging. This is where boundaries become more than a popular psychological word. A boundary is not simply a threat or a punishment. It can be a decision about what a person will participate in and what they will no longer accept. Repeated emotional pain can make that distinction much clearer. Instead of constantly asking, "How can I make this person feel better?" they may begin asking, "What happens to me when I keep staying in this situation?" That question changes the center of attention. The other person's emotions are no longer the only emotions that matter. Their own peace enters the equation. Their own needs become visible again. And slowly another transformation begins. They stop reacting to potential and start responding to patterns. Earlier they may have been deeply attached to who someone could become. They saw the good qualities. They saw the potential. They remembered the beautiful moments. They focused on the version of the person that appeared during the best days, and hoped that version would eventually become permanent. But repeated experiences can make potential less convincing. The person starts looking at consistency instead. Promises become less powerful when they are repeatedly broken. Apologies become less meaningful when the same behavior continues. Emotional speeches lose their impact when daily actions tell a different story. The internal question changes. Instead of asking, "Why are they doing this?" they begin asking, "What is their repeated behavior telling me?" That question is much more difficult because it requires accepting evidence instead of holding on to hope alone. It does not mean becoming cynical. It means becoming more accurate. A person can still believe someone has good qualities while recognizing that those qualities may not make the relationship healthy. They can believe someone has potential while accepting that potential is not the same as present behavior. They can hope someone changes without waiting forever for that change. This is where emotional intelligence becomes practical. Emotional intelligence is not simply knowing what everyone feels. It also involves recognizing patterns, regulating your own responses, and making decisions based on reality rather than emotional pressure. And once this awareness develops, silence can begin to serve a different purpose. Silence does not automatically mean punishment. It does not automatically mean manipulation. It does not always mean that someone stopped caring. Sometimes silence is simply what happens when a person realizes they have already explained enough. They may have communicated the problem several times. They may have described what hurt them. They may have asked for change. They may have given another opportunity. When nothing meaningful changes, another explanation can begin to feel pointless. So they stop talking. They take distance. They create space between themselves and the emotional situation. That space can allow them to hear their own thoughts without constantly reacting to someone else's emotions. In healthy situations, taking a pause can support emotional regulation. But silence itself is not automatically healthy or unhealthy. Its meaning depends on why it is being used. Silence used to punish someone is very different from silence used to protect one's emotional stability. That distinction matters because emotional withdrawal can sometimes be part of avoidance, while in other situations it can be a deliberate attempt to reduce emotional overload. The deeper transformation occurs when the person becomes less controlled by emotional pressure. Repeated pain can teach them to recognize certain patterns earlier. They may notice when guilt is being used to force compliance. They may recognize when affection suddenly appears only after they create distance. They may notice when someone repeatedly crosses a boundary and then becomes emotional when confronted. They may recognize the difference between genuine accountability and an apology designed only to end an uncomfortable conversation. These observations do not mean the person has become suspicious of everyone. They mean their attention has become sharper. Their empathy remains, but automatic compliance decreases. That is a crucial difference. Before, someone else's pain may have immediately triggered the need to rescue them. Now the person may pause and ask whether helping is actually appropriate. Before, someone else's anger may have made them rush to apologize. Now they may consider whether they are actually responsible. Before, someone withdrawing affection may have created panic. Now they may recognize that losing access to them is not the same as losing their worth. This is why the person may appear dramatically different after repeated emotional hurt. The softness may still be there, but the automatic reactions are no longer controlling every decision. They can feel compassion without surrendering their judgment. They can feel love without ignoring patterns. They can feel sadness without immediately returning to the source of the sadness. They can miss someone without deciding that the relationship must be restored. And perhaps the most powerful change is that emotional pressure begins losing its ability to control them. A guilt trip may still hurt, but it may no longer determine their decision. Someone's disappointment may still matter, but it may no longer override their boundary. Someone's sudden affection may still feel good, but it may no longer erase months of inconsistent behavior. The heart may remain soft while the boundaries become strong. That is the hidden transformation. The person does not necessarily become colder. They become more selective about where their warmth goes. They do not necessarily lose trust. They learn that trust should be built through repeated evidence. They do not necessarily stop loving. They learn that love without boundaries can become another form of suffering. And after enough experiences, they begin to understand a truth that can take years to learn. Being a compassionate person does not require being permanently available to everyone who knows how to reach your emotions. In the end, the greatest transformation is not that the empath becomes cold. It is that they finally become selective with the heart they spent so long giving away. Repeated hurt may change the way they trust, the way they communicate, and the way they respond to emotional pressure, but it does not have to destroy their capacity to care. The person who once needed everyone to understand their feelings eventually realizes that being understood by everyone is not necessary. The person who once explained every boundary begins to simply live by those boundaries. The person who once believed forgiveness meant giving someone another opportunity learns that forgiveness and access are two completely different things. You can forgive someone and still walk away. You can understand someone's pain and still protect your own. You can love someone and still decide that they no longer belong in the closest parts of your life. That is not cruelty. That is emotional maturity. Repeated hurt does not always destroy empathy. Sometimes, it teaches empathy where it belongs. It teaches you that compassion should not require self-abandonment. It teaches you that kindness does not mean unlimited access. It teaches you that someone's sadness does not automatically become your responsibility. And perhaps the most powerful lesson is this: you do not have to become ruthless to become strong. You do not have to stop caring to protect yourself. You do not have to harden your heart just because someone failed to respect it. You can remain soft and still have strong boundaries. You can remain compassionate and still say no. You can love deeply and still choose yourself. That is the hidden strength behind the silence of someone who has been hurt too many times. They are not necessarily empty. They may simply have stopped giving their deepest emotions to people who repeatedly proved they could not handle them with care. Their heart is still there. Their empathy is still there. Their capacity to love is still there. The difference is that now, access has to be earned. And maybe that is the real comeback. Not becoming someone who feels nothing, but becoming someone who finally understands what deserves their feelings. If this message spoke to something you have experienced, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who may need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more deep psychological insights into human behavior, emotions, relationships, and the hidden patterns that shape us. And remember, protecting your peace does not mean you stopped caring. Sometimes it means you finally started caring about yourself too.